For the Wild podcast is brought to you in part by the Calliopeia Foundation and listeners like you. Calliopeia supports projects interweaving spirituality, culture, and ecology. We are grateful for their support and the support of grassroots contributions from listeners. To learn more about the Calliopeia Foundation, visit calliopeia.org. To make a donation to For the Wild, visit forthewild.world/donate or support us through Patreon.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today I'm speaking with Antonia Jhuhasz, a leading energy analyst, author, and investigative journalist specializing in oil.
The United States is now a player with Russia and Saudi Arabia in determining how oil shapes the global economy by being able to now be a country that controls a huge spigot of oil and natural gas. And that has been to the detriment of tribal sovereignty, public health, the environment, the climate.
An award-winning writer, Antonia's articles appear in Rolling Stone, Harper's Magazine, Newsweek, The Atlantic, CNN.com, The Nation, Miss Magazine, The Advocate, Pacific Standard Magazine, and many more. Antonia is the author of 3 books, including Black Tide, The Tyranny of Oil, and The Bush Agenda. Welcome, Antonia. It's such a great honor to be in conversation with you today. Welcome to For the Wild.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to speak with you.
Wonderful. Well, to jump right in, I'm hoping we can bring a bit of context to our conversation around the landscape of oil production and the energy economy, specifically in the U.S. Now, currently, the U.S. is producing more oil and natural gas than any time in its history, and we are in fact the largest producer of oil and natural gas combined. Now, there's a lot of information and historical analysis to unpack within this statistic alone, but to begin, I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of the scope and scale of our national fossil fuel sector, and perhaps offer a historical point of reference. What does oil production look like today in the U.S., and how has this been shaped by the fracking boom?
Well, I guess the first thing I'll just say is to add to my introduction that I am currently a Ted Scripps Fellow at the Center for Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And that's a 1-year fellowship that brings working journalists to the university to do their research, to audit classes, and to focus on a special project. And so the advantage of having that fellowship is that I'm sitting here in Colorado and able to speak from within a state that has really been transformed in the last 10 years because of the fracking boom. And my writing on the industry, I can go back all the way to the beginning in the 1860s of oil production, which started in the United States and Pennsylvania, and then continued from there. That's really the topic of my second book, which is entitled The Tyranny of Oil. But I don't think we need quite that much history. I think the most important sort of summary that I would say is to really think of oil production, not just in the United States, which is one of the places where it began and took hold, but globally as a really fairly new phenomena. We've only been doing mass production of oil and natural gas for about 150 years. The natural seepage of oil out of the earth or out of the bottom of the ocean, which it has naturally done for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, is something that humans have made use of for thousands of years, and using it for things like sealants on canoes or as a health remedy. And that was really, I would say, humans coexisting with oil and natural gas, which are naturally occurring phenomena. Of course, they're not renewable resources, but they are natural resources. Humans coexisting with those resources for thousands and thousands of years. It's really only in the last 150 that we turned these resources, including coal, into mass produced items, and then in a very, very short time span into resources that are threatening our existence on the planet. But The United States is one of the places where those operations really began and took root. And we saw ups and downs in production throughout US history with really great impacts on our domestic economy, our foreign policy, and we can talk at length about that. But I will just sort of jump ahead to the current situation or the current history, which, as you had suggested in your introduction, has really been brought about by fracking. And that's what's happening here in Colorado. So, fracking is a technique, a mode of drilling for oil and natural gas that is a technique that's been around for a very long time. But what happened around 2005 during the Bush administration was a massive deregulation and an opening up of new areas to fracking, and the addition of an additional technique, which is horizontal drilling, which is you go down into an area, whereas oil has traditionally existed in the earth in essentially, though not exactly, pools of oil, kind of like a reservoir of oil under the ground. The difference with fracking for oil is that the oil is instead found buried within a shale bed, or the natural gas is in a shale bed, a rock bed under the earth, and that the producers need to break that rock, fracture it, in order to release the hydrocarbons and then to get them back above ground without making the earth collapse. And the process of fracturing that rock, opening up a space to release the oil and natural gas, bring it above ground, is a process that's very water and chemical intensive, very machine intensive, much more intensive than traditional drilling. That's called fracking. And then this other piece of technology, horizontal drilling, is really what changed the entire face of drilling in the United States, which is being able to go down and then out into this rock bed for a distance of miles with the pipe running miles underground to open up the oil and natural gas and get it out of the ground. And that process, along with the deregulation put in place by the Bush administration, just transformed production across the United States. So not only was there this new technology, there was this extreme willingness to make sacrifices to the environment, to public health, to worker safety in order to really move aggressively to expand the use of this technology across the United States. And that just sent the United States into a whole nother realm of production that started in the Bush administration, continued throughout administrations, really hitting its high speed in the Trump administration, to the point today where, I think most people across the United States, in many states across the United States, many more than previously, now know what it feels like to live near oil and gas operations, whereas that used to be something that was experienced in other countries, and then the oil and natural gas was sent here, or in a handful of states. So Texas, Alaska, where I used to live, California, these are major oil producing states. Now that list goes on and on and on and on of states that are major oil and natural gas producers and communities that are experiencing what it means to live near those production. And now, just actually in the last week, in the middle of the coronavirus epidemic, in the middle of COVID-19, the United States reached its highest weekly oil production in history, oil and natural gas production in history, because that production just keeps on going and keeps moving forward to the place that we're in now, where the United States is now, with the Soviet Union and Russia, the three nations that determine the price of oil, the amount of oil and natural gas that's produced, which I'll take a breath, let you ask another question, but that has really taken us also into this place where we are right now in the midst of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, where our economy is also, the global economy is teetering because not only of the many problems associated with the epidemic, but also mass overproduction, a glut of production of oil in particular, which has led the price of oil to crash, which is also causing the global economy to crash. And I think that brings us to where we are with the scale and scope of oil production in the United States today.
Mm, wow. This is completely fascinating in an extremely disturbing way, all of these details that you've shared with us. And I know that there must be so many more. I do have a list of questions to ask you, but I do feel that it's important to share a bit more about this current moment we're in with COVID-19, with this economic crash that we are sliding into right now. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing a bit more of what you started to just touch on just a few moments ago, I think it would be really important for us to understand this connection more of the oil and gas production, COVID-19, and the economic downfall.
Sure. I think that what's so terrifyingly fascinating right now is how similar our economic circumstances are to where they were in 2008, which was, of course, a massive global financial collapse. And the financial collapse is most often, most immediately attributed to the mortgage crisis, the mortgage bubble, and banks like Lehman Brothers. I knew what I was saying. It didn't sound right to me. That was Lehman Brothers crashing, which it certainly was a cause of the financial crisis. But those conditions were preceded by the price of oil skyrocketing to $150 a barrel, the highest amount in modern history. That price of oil was too much for consuming countries to afford. So they basically, every country that is dependent on purchasing oil suddenly had to redirect all of this money to the purchase of oil and away from other places. And that was also happening within the United States with purchasers of oil having to redirect money out of other investments and other places that they were holding money and into the purchase of oil. That rush out of money from other places created a market vacuum where oil was draining out of other places. And one of the places it was draining out of was propping up the mortgage bubble, the housing bubble, and this sort of fake economy that had been created that was propping up this bubble. And when that bubble then burst, it took the banks, the mortgage lending industry with it. And those combined forces created the global economic collapse. And that level of the economy just being hardwired to oil is as true now as it was then. But what we started to experience several weeks ago is the opposite. So, what happened several weeks ago was the oil industry has already been pumping out just way too much oil. The world is trying aggressively to move away from fossil fuels. We have policies put in place at local levels, at state levels, at federal levels, internationally, all with this goal of decarbonizing our economy in order to, for many reasons, including to halt the impacts of the climate crisis. And that attempt to move away from fossil fuels and oil in particular, at the same time as you've got economies that are just pumping out more and more of it, the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, is already leading to an oil glut, just too much of this product. Also, because there's been this movement among activists, among social movements to try and focus on, how is this industry being continued to be supported? And one of the main ways is through banks lending money to oil companies, big and small, to sort of prop them up. Activists have been targeting that lending and have said, we don't want banks that are investing in fossil fuels. We want you to stop doing that investing. And so banks and hedge funds have been, many of them, certainly not all, moving away from fossil fuels. And that all created this very delicate situation where when the members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and Russia, met several weeks ago to figure out what to do about what was clear to be a fall in demand for oil in light of the COVID-19 crisis, there was a break between Russia and Saudi Arabia, with both countries saying, okay, the market's going to fall even further for oil. We already have a falling oil demand, but our economies are dependent on this product. So if we're going to keep making as much money as we need to from oil, and oil is worth less, we're going to have to produce even more of it to get the same return. And they were each trying to undercut each other's markets and to try and undercut US production. And they said, we're going to produce even more, and we're going to produce it cheaper, and we're going to try and steal each other's markets. And that threat of increased production at the same time as falling demand led the price of oil to crash, and it continues to fall and fall and fall and fall. So now we have the opposite of 2008, when you had this incredibly expensive oil that was really hard for consumers to purchase. Now we have the opposite, incredibly low oil prices that is extremely difficult for any country that is reliant on producing oil, which is countries all over the world for their income. Now they're struggling. And that struggle has meant that they are also, now they don't have enough money to put into other things because they are not getting in income. And so that is also creating more of a hole in the economy where there's less money to buy other products and less money circulating. And that's also now contributing to this overall global collapse. And the end result of that story should be, we need to learn a lesson, which is this hardwiring ourselves to this incredibly volatile, incredibly problematic resource isn't working out. It's only going to be more volatile. The world is only going to be more volatile moving forward. It was certainly predicted long ago that with the worsening climate crisis, pandemics were likely to increase, and that obviously a continuous increase in crises, fires, floods, storms, droughts, are our future. And so hardwiring ourselves to this incredibly volatile resource is just proving to be exceptionally difficult as a model. And that's why so many people are putting forward that the solution to this current oil crisis isn't to double down further on oil or fossil fuels, but rather to really aggressively put in place the transition to renewables and to potentially use this crisis as an opportunity to do so. And that's not certainly something that's being reflected among President Trump or Putin or Mohammed bin Salman, but it's certainly being advocated by their members of each of their governments and certainly of their populace as well.
Wow, Antonia, you have just totally blown my mind with what you have been sharing. And thank you so much for speaking to the recent negotiations among the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. That is definitely something that was on my mind. And also just how you spoke to the unstable foundation of debt upon which the oil and gas industry rests, and the way the banks are all intertwined and the price is going down. And it's just honestly so important for us to understand this. And you have such an incredible way of really clearly explaining some extremely complicated global relationships in your response. So thank you so much for that. Now, as we wrap our minds around the implications of the rampant rise of oil production, like you've been mentioning, which has more than doubled over the past decade, it feels important to center the people and places where development has descended and speak to the exploitation that comes hand in hand with this kind of boom and bust industry. I'm thinking of the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico, and the Appalachian Basin across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. And then, of course, there's the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota that many of us know about. So as someone who has been reporting on the ground for years, I'm wondering if you could illustrate what one of these oil and gas fields actually looks like. And broadly speaking, how does fracking change a place, whether that be in regards to local politics, the social landscape, economics, or ecological transformation?
Sure. I think maybe I'll just continue to stay in place where I'm at, which is Colorado, which is also where I'm from. Colorado. I grew up here, but I haven't lived here for the last 30 years, as I've lived across the country and been reporting across the country and around the world. But coming back here 30 years later, after Colorado has seen a tenfold increase in its oil production in the last decade. So it went from just a sort of very steady, consistent oil producing state to now the sixth largest oil producing state in the country. 90% of the oil production is coming from one county, which is Weld County, which is also disproportionately Hispanic and has a 30% Hispanic population, significantly larger than the rest of the state, and had always been an agricultural community really driven by the agriculture sector, which has now been just is getting increasingly squeezed out by oil production. And one of the things that's happening here, which is somewhat unique, it's something that has been happening in Los Angeles for decades, which is residential drilling, which is oil production taking place right next to, in the middle of residential communities. What's different from Los Angeles, because that is the old oil derrick form of production where you've got a reservoir, you've got a derrick that just has been pumping for a very long time, which certainly creates health hazards and environmental hazards. But what's different here is that it's fracking operations that are happening near schools in residential neighborhoods. So one really important example, I went out to Greeley in Weld County to interview a woman named Patricia Nelson, and she lives about a block and a half from a almost entirely Hispanic school, Bella Romero, which is where many of her nieces and nephews attend school. That school now has a massive fracking operation taking place just beyond the playground. And it was a fracking operation that had originally been planned near a different school, which is a predominantly white school in a predominantly white neighborhood. That community protested and they relocated to this predominantly low income Hispanic neighborhood and school. And that production has been releasing illegal quantities of benzene, which is a cancer causing chemical byproduct of production. It has been threatening the health and safety of the community there, and they have been trying to get it stopped unsuccessfully as a result of these benzene spikes, as a result of people and children living in the neighborhood and going to the school who have been experiencing nosebleeds, nausea, headaches, as there's been increasing health studies done in the state confirming findings that have been done, which is that exposure to oil and gas production is well documented to increase the likelihood of cancers, but also for women to have a deleterious effect on being able to maintain a pregnancy and then have a healthy pregnancy to term, and then also associated with potential developmental disorders for the child, and just a whole host of well documented human health impacts. And those human health impacts associated with oil production, with fracking, they almost all get worse the closer you live or work or attend school to those operations. So to see these operations increasingly moving into where people live, where they go to school, where they spend all day, means that the already well documented human health impacts that are being reported across the country are only even more intensified here. And what's also anticipated is that this model that's happening in Colorado, this residential drilling, is expected to expand to other areas. So whereas one will typically often see oil production and fracking often taking place in more rural areas further away from communities, this new wave of residential drilling is extremely problematic and is only likely to intensify the human health impacts and the environmental impacts that are well documented elsewhere. I mean, I think other places where we've seen this are locations where fracking has gone on for longer periods of time with less oversight. So Ohio is a good example. Pennsylvania is another example. And there have been cancer clusters identified as being associated with the production that's taking place in those areas. And I think communities, for as long as there's been fracking, for as long as there's been oil production since the 1860s, at the founding of oil production in Pennsylvania in 1860s, there were mass protests against the production taking place and for health and safety of workers and for those communities. There have been communities that have been trying to stop these operations. And what's mostly happened over the last decade is greater education, greater research that has also expanded the number of people who are understandably opposed to that production taking place where they live, at the same time as there's been this continual willingness to allow those operations to move forward. And that's not true across the board. Of course, you've got states like New York, which have banned fracking altogether. You've got national proposals put forward by leading candidates for president, such as Bernie Sanders, such as Elizabeth Warren, calling for full bans on fracking across the United States. So you've got sort of these two simultaneous movements happening at the same time. And I think both the continued expansion of the operations and the push to stop them, and that's not a coincidence. I think the more people that experience these operations firsthand, the more that oppose them. The problem is that once the operations start, it becomes harder generally to unwind them. So in New York, for example, there hadn't really been any operations when the ban was put in place. The more that the operations are allowed to move forward, the harder it is to move backwards.
Synapse firing, shelling in the darkness. I feel like a crowd, all their voices in my lungs. It's hard to hold a sense of brotherhood between siblings taught to speak in different tongues. Nothing like you told me. Try not to speak and just behold me. Not every part of us is on a line.
It's just so important for us to wrap our minds around this, as so many of us, like you were saying, are living in places where there is oil extraction happening in our own neighborhoods. And yeah, it's just, oof. Well, now, Antonia, I'd like to focus on the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota, where you wrote a 15-month investigative piece in Pacific Standard magazine called Death of the Dakota Access back in 2018. Now, as told through the parallel stories of two pipeline construction workers, Nicholas Jansich and Troy Dolan, you conclude that, quote, building oil and natural gas pipelines is one of the deadliest jobs in America. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the crux of what makes the oil and natural gas industry so fatal to workers, particularly in places like North Dakota. And within your answer, perhaps you could share some of your most striking findings from your investigation in the heart of American oil country.
Sure. So what I was doing with this investigation, it's Death on the Dakota Access, and it was published in Pacific Standard magazine in 2018. So there had been a great deal of focus on how dangerous oil and gas extraction work is for workers who produce oil and gas, who get it out of the ground. And that has been consistently finding that producing oil and gas is one of the deadliest jobs in the United States, at times having a fatality rate 7.5 times the national average, and that has been a focus of concern and research, but that there hadn't been a similar focus to pipeline construction and what it means to be a pipeline worker. I had been reporting from the water protector efforts to halt construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline for some time, and reporting on those efforts by, just to sort of backtrack a little bit because it reflects back on the conversation we were having before. North Dakota is a state that has really been at the heart of the fracking boom and saw, like Colorado, as I was describing, but even more so, just a huge dramatic increase in oil production in particular coming from fracking, and that a great deal of that production was taking place on Native American lands and Native American territory. And those communities that had already been working against those oil and gas operations that already existed in primarily oil in that state, those Native American communities, very quickly, when the proposal for the Dakota Access Pipeline was put forward, were rejecting having the pipeline on their territory because they were well aware of the risks associated, having experienced a tremendous amount of oil spills, all sorts of flaring and other human health impacts of the fracking operations that already took place where they live, the experience of the economic ups and downs that came with the oil production, and not wanting to see the risks associated with pipeline construction come where they live. And similar to the story that I described with the Bella Romero School here in Colorado, the Dakota Access Pipeline was originally supposed to go on a path that took it in a largely white area of North Dakota. And then when that area protested, it was redirected onto near the Standing Rock Sioux tribes land. And that construction got underway under fierce resistance. But while that construction was taking place, I also wanted to know, in addition to reporting on the opposition of where the pipeline was going to be situated in the communities that lived there and would be impacted by if there was failure to that construction, the people whose job it was to create the pipeline as well. So I did this investigation on pipeline worker safety. And what I found was that though it had not been well reported, there were 2 deaths of pipeline construction workers during the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline, Nicholas Janisich and Troy Dolan. They died at opposite ends of the pipeline doing different methods of construction. And then starting from there, I started looking at how safe or dangerous is pipeline construction in general. And I found that while the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces fatality rates for oil and gas extraction, like it does for many other sectors of the economy, it had never produced a fatality rate for oil and pipeline construction. So I had to use their methodology, to follow that methodology and adhere to their methodology to determine the fatality statistic myself, which I did. And what I found was that unfortunately, oil and gas pipeline construction workers, similarly to extraction workers, have among the highest fatality rates for any job in the country. There has been, and this was intensified during the Trump administration, a extreme lack of regulation over the safety of workers who do oil and gas work across the board. And one of the main reasons for that is that they work within an industry that is extremely powerful politically, and they have historically been almost entirely non-unionized. So they have not had a strong union to protect them, and they have had a very strong worker to try to have as few regulations over them as possible. And that means that you have a great deal of dangerous work being done under dangerous conditions. And I would say that those parts of the job that are unionized, which, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline was done by union labor. I did find that union jobs overall have a much lower fatality rate than those that aren't unionized. But overall, because this job sector has very, very, very low unionization, it has an incredibly high fatality and injury rate. So it's dangerous, hard work that's being done under conditions that do not provide the appropriate level of regulatory oversight or protection for their workers. It's also a very transitory set of workers. They're often, increasingly, it is a undocumented labor pool, which means that there are workers who are not willing to speak up when they're put into, or not able to speak up when they're put into extremely dangerous working conditions for fear of retaliation against their own status and that of their family. And so this combination just creates extremely, extremely dangerous working conditions. And then when you add to those factors, oil and natural gas are, of course, volatile products. They are dangerous to work with. They make the work so much more dangerous. That adds to having this higher fatality rate. And building pipelines is similar to construction work, which is also has a very, very high fatality and injury rate. And so it all goes to this sort of deeply problematic working environment where workers are put into dangerous situations without appropriate protections, made all the worse by the fact that you're working with extremely volatile resources.
Yeah. Well, within this period of untethered expansion of oil, natural gas, and coal production, I'd like to turn our attention to the current administration, which marks a key shift within US energy policy away from energy independence to energy dominance. So I'm wondering if you could give us more specific information on what has been unleashed by the Trump administration and some of the most important legislative or policy changes that you've seen over the past 4 years. And perhaps as a second part to that question, I want to say that for years, the Oil Change International has proclaimed we must demand a separation of oil and state. So with this in mind, as we move closer to November elections, I'm sure our listeners would be curious to hear what considerations to hold close as they head to the polls to vote.
Sure. And I think maybe starting with the second part of your question, what's been really transformative about this entire election cycle is this focus on the separation of oil and state, which has been adopted by people across the country. And very early on, there was a movement to remove fossil fuel money from the electoral process. And in just an absolutely unprecedented turn of events through that organizing, through hard work and organizing by advocacy organizations, activists, people on the ground, concerned people, every major Democratic candidate for president, with a very small list of exceptions, but every candidate who I think is well known to the public agreed to a pledge not to accept fossil fuel money in their campaigns. And that has absolutely never happened before. And that was definitely a result of the awareness of the public that it was just increasingly difficult to have an impact on the fossil fuel industry when it continued to exercise such sway over politicians. And so the willingness to take the fossil fuel pledge was incredibly unique to see so many candidates being willing to do that. And then beyond that, to have candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren state that part of their platform was ending fracking, and not just usually bans on oil production in the United States have tended to be bans that do not act retroactively. So, for example, California implemented a ban on offshore oil drilling as a result of the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill, but any operations that were already in place before then stayed, which is why there is still drilling off the coast of Santa Barbara, because it was grandfathered in. But these calls for fracking bans are calling for not only a halt to permitting for any new fracking, but then moving aggressively retroactively to undo existing operations as well. Again, just sort of unprecedented. But many candidates, including Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, not only introduced, and Sanders and Warren, also introduced really unprecedented climate crisis platforms and environmental justice platforms, and platforms that include policies for just transition. And that, again, just sort of unprecedented across the board, the level of detail on environmental justice, I would say in particular, and just transition, which is a somewhat fairly new concept, also embraced within these platforms. And I think that's just so different from what has come before. But then compared to the Trump administration, and sort of starting back with the question that you asked, the Trump administration has obviously gone in the opposite approach. So the Trump administration introduced a new idea into the American lexicon on oil and gas, which it had been for decades. American presidents had declared, whether they meant it or not, that they wanted to make America energy independent. So declare our independence from reliance on other sources of oil. And like I said, some meant it, some didn't, but that was their stated position. Trump came in, and his administration declared that the United States would not only seek to be independent, but also seek global energy dominance, to exert American power by being a massive oil and gas producer, and to join the ranks of Russia and Saudi Arabia as a nation that wields its power in all the traditional ways that it has already done so through its role as being massive oil and gas producer. And to achieve that, the Trump administration just moved aggressively on a deregulatory process. So within just the first 6 months in office, through executive orders and rule changes, the Trump administration essentially froze the regulatory process, with nearly 300 federal regulations specifically related to energy production and environmental protection, affecting public health, worker safety, tribal sovereignty, and the climate, were rescinded, withdrawn, or otherwise stalled. And that is just across the board, eliminating rules that would protect each of those sectors. And then also just aggressively expanding the amount of public lands that are available to oil and gas drilling. So the Bureau of Land Management changed its oil and gas leasing policy to limit public comment and environmental reviews, to speed up permitting, and to expand leasing. And the result was 6 times the amount of public land was made available to oil and gas drilling than had been the case just 2 years earlier. And the amount of oil and natural gas wells now on lands administered by the Department of Interior increased by 85% in 1 year. So, this onslaught of new production taking place on public lands and on private lands, as we were already discussing with Colorado and North Dakota, has just outpaced the ability of state regulators, federal regulators, to keep up with the amount of production that's happening, to even implement the rules that are still left on the books. And so that has resulted in the Trump administration succeeding in its stated goal. The United States is now a player with Russia and Saudi Arabia in determining how oil shapes the global economy, by being able to now be a country that controls a huge spigot of oil and natural gas. And that has been to the detriment of tribal sovereignty, public health, the environment, the climate, just the ability to enjoy the natural environment. That's certainly something I experience here in Colorado with the way that the state has been transformed, a state that loves its environment and loves being in it. That has also been transformed. And that is true across, states across the country. And so that has only been accelerated. And it seems like we'll know more when this interview airs, but right now we're right in the middle of the discussion over the $2 trillion stimulus package in the wake of COVID-19. And it seems clear that while there are many, many important provisions within the stimulus that will help workers, that are directed towards tribal communities, that will help average families, there's also a push among the industry to continue with deregulation. So to use the COVID-19 crisis as a reason to say and to argue, which they are arguing, that they should have even less enforcement of health and safety regulations right now because they need to just keep producing, and that a large, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars worth of the stimulus package will go towards propping up the failing industry. So I guess one of the things I didn't say was that even though there is all this production taking place across the United States, US fracking companies in particular, the small and medium-sized ones, have been losing money for decades. They are about $200 billion in debt in the United States alone, and that's 200 with a B. They have losing money, but they've been being propped up by the banks. And now the banks, as I said earlier, are rethinking that approach because of a tremendous amount of activism. And now the federal government may step in and provide that support to an industry that in any sort of traditional market economy would have been allowed to fail because it's not making money, or in an economy that is trying to transition through a just transition to a green economy would have been allowed to fail because the transition can only happen if those companies aren't operating at the same scale that they currently are. And so the Trump administration and the GOP Congress is certainly trying to put forward this model of how do we use the stimulus to continue to deregulate the industry and to continue to prop up fossil fuels. At the same time, there is a very, very strong movement trying to do the opposite, to implement a green stimulus package, to try to continue to move forward on a just transition, a green transition, and to use that as a way to say, how do we envision a healthier economy moving forward, not just recreating the same problems that have gotten us to where we are. And so I think as we look to the election in November, there's obviously two very different visions of the future that have been put forward by candidates running for president on the Democratic side versus the model that's being put forward by the Trump administration. And we'll see how, all of this plays out in light of having to respond immediately to the horrifying and terrible crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully, when this interview airs, things will be looking up from where they are right now while we're conducting the interview.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Antonia, thank you for all of that. And it's so important for all of our listeners to understand what you're speaking to, with just to understand it at all, but to, to really start to dig deeper, because these policies and deregulations that are being put into place right now, and of course the things have already been put into place by the Trump administration, but right now there's so much at stake. While crisis is upon us, it's a time where the government can really make a lot of moves. And just following this thread of Trump's legacy, in January 2018, the Trump administration announced plans to open up more than 90% of all federal waters to offshore oil and gas leasing, and later issued an executive order that undid protections put in place by the Obama administration in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon explosion. In March of last year, a U.S. District Court judge blocked plans to reopen vast portions of Alaska's Arctic waters to drilling. However, there still remains significant uncertainty about how the Interior Department will proceed with its 5-year offshore oil and gas leasing plan. So, speaking from your experience reporting on the Exxon Valdez and BP Deepwater Horizon spills, what are the most important measures to safeguard as we move into these uncertain political times? What is at stake in the billion plus acres off the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic coast?
One of the things that happened when the Trump administration put forward its 5-year drilling plan that called for opening up essentially all federal waters, there were a few exceptions to offshore oil drilling. And the exceptions are always right off the coast of Florida because it's too politically sensitive. And there were parts of Alaska, limited parts of Alaska, that would have been protected as well. It led to a huge backlash. So governors, even Republican governors, even conservative governors of states where there wasn't offshore oil drilling, did not want to see offshore oil drilling come to their shores. Communities that are dependent off of the water all across the country, fisher communities, communities that this is their source of livelihood, but also subsistence, were opposed to offshore oil drilling coming where they live. Economies that were dependent on tourism were opposed to it. Economies that are dependent on people going out into boats and enjoying the water were opposed to it. And there was a huge backlash. So much so that the Trump Interior Department really backtracked off of this initial plan. But as you say, it's still the intention of the Trump administration, and it's still on the books to move forward with a plan that would start leasing in essentially all waters off the United States. Now, again, this is a place where there is just an extreme difference on the part of candidates running for Democratic office. I'm not sure the extent of what Joe Biden has proposed. I know that he has called for an end to the money that goes to the fossil fuel industry, the tax breaks and the various subsidies that the industry gets. I know that he has called for some new regulation. I'm not sure of his position on leasing. I do know that Sanders and Warren had both called for no new leasing at all for new oil and gas operations in offshore waters anywhere in the United States, in federal offshore waters, and no new leasing for oil, gas, or coal on federal land. And so that's obviously a diametric difference between the Trump administration and at least Sanders and Warren. I would imagine that it is certainly less than the Trump administration's, because during the Obama administration, there certainly had not been this type of an expansive increase in offshore oil drilling. The Obama administration definitely expanded drilling in the places where it already exists, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. But the Obama administration had put in place a moratorium on drilling in the Alaskan Arctic and had joined with the Trudeau administration in Canada to implement a similar moratorium in Canadian Arctic waters. And the Obama administration had put in place new protections in light of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And as you said, the Trump administration then lifted those new protections that were put in place to try and stop another Deepwater Horizon sized disaster from happening again, the largest offshore drilling oil spill in US history. Where we are right now is, if there's a second term for the Trump administration and the economy is still able to do anything in light of the coronavirus. My guess is that the Trump administration would be deeply emboldened in a second term to move forward on everything that the Trump administration was not able to fully embrace in the first term. And that things like expanded offshore oil drilling, the things that really separate Trump from the Democrats, are things that I would imagine the Trump administration feeling deeply emboldened to move forward on. So while there was a temerity to move forward on offshore drilling in the first term, I would certainly see that as a potential area of expansion in a second term. And again, just a place where the differences are stark, but also there aren't protections. So there used to be moratoriums on offshore drilling in the Pacific. There used to be moratoriums on offshore drilling in the Atlantic. Those were lifted during the Bush administration. And I think many people still think they exist, but they don't. The only thing that has stopped new drilling in the Pacific, drilling in the Atlantic, more drilling in Alaska, and even greater drilling in the Gulf of Mexico is the decision of the federal government to offer leases or not in those waters. The Obama administration did not offer leases in the Pacific or the Atlantic. And in the Arctic, the Trump administration wants to offer leases there. And it can. In most of those waters, there isn't anything stopping them except for the willingness to do so. And so that's where a different administration could make a really dramatic difference in whether not only do we continue to see this expansion of drilling across the land, but new and expanded drilling offshore as well.
I'm still waiting at the sea after all of the tragedies of winter. Everything I hear rounds its edges and grows thinner. My head collecting evidence, just in chemical white. There are things that I see, there are things that I've seen. They move in and out of focus somewhere other than my sight. Why was I disquieted? Not to let your heart lay down this heavy load. Lay it down this heavy load.
I want to speak to one of your most recent pieces for Rolling Stone. You write on Louisiana's Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch along the banks of the Mississippi River, where industry leaders like ExxonMobil, Coke, and Shell operate about 150 fossil fuel and petrochemical facilities. In this piece, you note that much of the new infrastructure pushing into the St. James Parish is dedicated to plastics, 99% of which is made from chemicals derived from oil and natural gas. I was equally stunned to read that the International Energy Agency predicts that in 2050, 50% of the growth in oil demand will be related to plastics production, overtaking oil demand for passenger cars. So why is the oil oligarchy pushing plastics? And does this issue raise the need to address both ends of production and consumption, say around single-use plastics, for instance?
So this investigation, as you had said, for Rolling Stone, took me into St. James Parish, Louisiana, which is the heart of what's already known as Cancer Alley in Louisiana. It's where there's 150 petrochemical complexes already operate in a predominantly African-American low-income communities in Louisiana. And as the push to get off of oil and fossil fuels has really taken shape and has really been advocated, as I had mentioned earlier, at local, state, federal, international levels, the oil and gas industry is trying to save itself by saying, well, we'll keep producing oil and natural gas, but if it's not going to be consumed as much for energy or for automobiles, then we'll produce it to have it turned into the feedstocks that go into plastics. And that has been a movement by the industry to try and save itself by seeing an expansion of plastics production and plastics consumption. And the places where these facilities, and these are massive facilities that convert the oil and natural gas into the feedstocks for plastics. So they are like refineries. They require an enormous amount of energy themselves to operate. They release an enormous amount of CO2. They are being located in the same places where the oil and gas facilities have always been located, and that's in low-income communities of color. And that is happening as well here. So we're seeing these new facilities being located in places like St. James Parish. And what I was reporting on was a new facility that's being proposed, the Formosa plant, which is in its contribution to CO2 emissions is the equivalent of 3 medium-sized coal plants, is being proposed right in the middle of this community. And the good news in the reporting that I was providing was that there's also a local movement. I focused on one 67-year-old former special education teacher, Sharon Levine, who's led a local effort to try to stop the construction of this plant and to implement what she wants to see as a moratorium on any new plants in St. James. And she was motivated to organize because the high school where she had worked was sold to a chemical company, and the high school was converted into the chemical company's offices, and she and the students were shipped off to another location across the water. And she finally stopped doing her teaching, retired so that she could focus full time on trying to stop this new onslaught of new operations coming into St. James Parish. And the link to what we were talking about before with the Dakota Access Pipeline is that the Dakota Access Pipeline continues on. It connects to another pipeline, which is called the ETCO pipeline, which then connects to the Bio Bridge pipeline, which ends in St. James Parish. So the oil and natural gas that's being produced in North Dakota finds its way to St. James Parish, Louisiana, among other locations, from which it is converted there into these feedstocks for plastics. And Sharon Levine and her organizing, her family had been in St. James for generations. Just outside her house is a plaque to the founders of St. James Parish. It's an area that was founded by former slaves. It was founded to be a place where they could be free and to focus on their own independence, and has a very strong sense of community built into that independence and built around sugarcane production. And this Formosa plant is being planned for to take over a massive sugarcane field that would be replaced with the petrochemical facility. And she very much sees the organizing there tied to the question of production. So the oil's coming from somewhere, it's coming from North Dakota. It's getting to St. James Parish somehow, it's getting there through a pipeline. Once it's in St. James Parish, it's being converted into another product, which is plastics. And to look at that whole chain and say, can we unravel that whole chain? And that's where, and to look at the people all along the way. And that's what her organizing has been involved in, and others in her community other members of her community traveled to North Dakota, for example, to meet with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe to talk about what it means to be where the pipeline is being constructed, and what it means to live where the oil is being produced, and then what it means to be at the end of the pipeline, and to work together. And that this was very much a part of the idea of keep it in the ground policies that say it's not just enough to look at, for example, ending emissions from oil and natural gas. So a lot of policy just looks at how do we cut emissions. So that would mean less oil that goes into cars, less coal that goes into energy plants, the emissions that come out of the product, but instead to look at the whole chain of the product and to say what we really need to do is just focus on policies that say we're not going to produce it anymore. If we don't produce oil and natural gas and coal anymore, then we won't need to transport it, then we won't be converting it into something else, then we won't be harming communities and the environment and the public all along the way. Some of that reporting was looking just at St. James Parish, but that's part of the context to answer your question on sort of how it fits into this larger keep it in the ground movement, really building steam and influence across the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Antonia. Now, in closing, this year, Rebecca Solnit penned a letter to a young activist on the first day of the new decade, writing, quote, "I have seen change that was unimaginable until it happened, and then became so ordinary seeming, a part of everyday life that people forgot that there was a struggle, forgot there was a transformation, forgot how we got here, forgot that we are living in the once unimaginable. I believe that there are many unimaginables in this moment that must become ordinary, including the end of the era of fossil fuel," end quote. Now, though written a few months ago, I think this piece speaks so beautifully to the moment we're in, as so much of what seems set in stone, static, and unchanging has once again been rendered dynamic and movable, from rent freezes to economic disruption to lowering CO2 levels. So I know you're in the middle of writing a book on this very topic. So as we close this conversation, I'd like to invite you to share any reflections on the end of the fossil fuel era and flipping the switch on the unimaginable.
Well, that was a lovely quote from Rebecca. Thank you for sharing that. I think that maybe the way to answer that is to say, I am in a state where there is enormous oil production taking place here. But there was in 2018 a push by local communities, organizers to get put in place elected officials that would better reflect their views on oil and gas production here. And they got a new Democratic governor, Jared Polis, a new state legislature that is now Democratic controlled. And those two bodies have put forward probably what is the most radical new oil and gas law in any state implemented in decades. And it's reorienting the entire focus of the oil and gas agency here from one who's tasked with promoting the production of oil and gas to one that is tasked with protecting public health and the environment. And it is putting in place rules that will likely make it extremely difficult, potentially, to expand oil and gas production here and make it possible for local communities to essentially ban new production where they live. And that ability to move from producer to sort of protector is something that would have been unthinkable even a couple years ago. I think there are so many movements taking place simultaneously for climate justice, for environmental justice, for economic justice, for social justice, that see shifting the just transition to a new green economy as paramount, that is already seeing really significant change. And I guess, I would add to this, and I did look this up. I pulled it up on my computer, looking at the records of the different Democratic candidates that are running for president. Joe Biden also, with Kamala Harris, with Elizabeth Warren, with Bernie Sanders, all called for no new leasing of oil and natural gas in public waters offshore, and no new leasing of oil and gas on public lands. And that includes Biden. Again, that just reflects how much change has happened and what the potential is moving forward.
Well, this is an episode that I know I'm going to re-listen to many times because it was so dense with information that we all really need to understand because it impacts us so deeply. There's so many facets to this all. And, Antonia, I could have spent hours in this interview with you asking you so many more questions because your knowledge is vast, but the way that you're able to explain this very complex web is so clear. And I so appreciate the years and years you have taken to be with people on the front lines, to understand the policies, and to be able to bring it to the public. So thank you for your dedication. It's been amazing to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your excellent questions and for listening. I really appreciate it. This is a time of physical distance, but social interaction is so important. And it was a pleasure to talk and to share my thoughts. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. I'm audio producer Andrew Storrs. The music you heard today was from Marty O'Reilly and the Old Soul Orchestra. I'd like to thank our host and founder, Ayana Young, as well as the rest of our podcast production team, Aidan McRae, Carter Lou McElroy, Hannah Wilton, Francesca Glassbell, Erica Eckram, Aaron Wise, and Melanie Younger.